Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Talk Insomnia episode in which I'm very happy to have Trevor as a guest. Welcome, Trevor.
Thanks, Daniel. It's good to be here.
So you and I connected, I think over Instagram, actually. My wife alerted me to like, oh, this account really makes sense. I get really interested. And so I'm really happy to have you here. And we'll talk about like your own journey towards like developing your own sleep coaching program, etc. But do take us back to where it all started, which was, in fact, I think you had some trouble sleeping.
Yeah, I did. So I was in grad school to be a mental health counselor, and I was working full time. So I had a lot on my plate, and I decided to take even more onto my plate and wanted to get up really early in the morning to do more things that were important to me. And I was very headstrong about this and really persisted in taking on these new commitments in the morning, even though my sleep started to deteriorate. And I had always been a great sleeper, so I didn't think much of it. But over time, as I persisted in trying to live a lifestyle that my body was pretty much saying no to, I developed this conditioned arousal where at first I'd be waking up in the middle of the night with a lot of anxiety, unable to fall back asleep, dreading how soon my alarm was going to go off and if I was going to have enough energy to get through the day. And before I knew it, that had spread like an infection to my sleep onset. And suddenly I couldn't go to sleep. If I did go to sleep, I was waking up in the middle of the night and I was a nervous wreck about it. It seemed to get worse and worse. I tried to do everything to fix it, especially the quick fixes. Some magical wind down routine in which I was doing everything perfectly at the precise moment that was going to shoot me off into slumber, or baths and long wind downs, but not as much of the cognitive behavioral stuff that I probably should have been doing earlier on. I just didn't know about it. When I first found out about it, it sounded scary, so I didn't want to do it.
And just
Especially,
sorry to interrupt her, but just so we have an idea, like when in time did this start happening?
when did I figure out
Oh
that
no,
I was
when did you start having like, when did you go into this mode of like, you were kind of pushing yourself and you started, when was that happening? How long ago?
about 3 years ago? And then I struggled with chronic insomnia for about 2 years, and it was some of the most hellish months of my life. I just felt so much despair, and my whole days seemed consumed by the dread I was feeling around my current state of being, and that the only thing that could help me feel better, which was sleep, was the one thing I couldn't have. And the more I thought about it, just the worse my insomnia got. And I'm someone who's really disciplined about making changes in my life to help myself. And it felt like there was absolutely nothing I could do to help myself. And it was extremely frustrating. I felt extremely hopeless and really was scared that this was going to be the rest of my life. That I had been going along and fortunately been sleeping well. Suddenly I was broken and it was going to stay that way. And it was very terrifying.
Wow. Oh my gosh. I can sense it as we're talking about it, how, how deep in the hole, if you will, you went. And
That was deep.
And now, uh, at this time, was it like you were actually studying to become a counselor, correct?
Yeah.
And how did that, like everything you learned, you would imagine would help, but apparently it didn't. Like, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. In mental health counseling, there's a lot of focus on processing emotions and learning how to relate to yourself in new ways, but it felt impenetrable, this insomnia problem. It felt like what I was learning could not be applied to it. Um, I couldn't just feel my way out of the hole I was in. It was like I didn't have any proper tool, is what it felt like. Nothing I was learning, even though it was related to emotional regulation and processing, seemed relevant to the struggle of insomnia.
Absolutely. So was it like that 2 year struggle you had, was most of the things you were trying to do to help yourself, was it mostly kind of like self-directed? You were experimenting with things that came from your own thinking, or did you go down the path that most people do, reading about like, sleep hygiene and things from the outside?
I read a lot about what was going on the outside because I didn't have a lot of confidence that I could figure my way out of this one. So I was very careful about how much caffeine I was consuming, thinking that that was going to be the magical cure. I was trying all kinds of supplements from kava, valerian, all kinds of medleys of different things. And sometimes it would work and that would get my hopes up really high, and then it would stop working or have side effects. And it just felt like, God, I want to be back to how I used to be. And it feels like there's no way.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's beautiful to be in a place that now I did find out that there was a way, and that I've regained the previous level of ease I had around sleep. Maybe a little bit, it's a little bit more, excuse me, more sensitive than it used to be, my sleep, but it's fine. It's good. I don't think about sleep during the day anymore.
And that's, I mean, we obviously we should spend a lot of time on that, like how you got to that place and what really helped you. But before we leave kind of like the insomnia part of it, like how, you know, you still, despite all this, you managed to get through your school, you graduated. So what was that like? Was it kind of like you had to kind of force yourself through your days, or what was your days like?
It really was very excruciating feeling sometimes. I really pushed myself through, and I think I created a lot of suffering for myself because of how much I was fixated on how bad I felt and how out of control I felt. I felt like my insomnia was kind of ripping me apart, and I was just kind of a zombie going through my days. And somehow I managed to keep up and do what I needed to do, but so much of my mental energy was devoted to thinking about my insomnia, worrying about my insomnia, trying to come up with the next fix. And it was like everything else was on the back burner, but somehow I managed to do it.
Absolutely. And just one last question on this is, and the reason I ask this one is because I think it's important for everyone that tunes in here to you know, to relate and see that yes, I'm you know, I'm in a very similar spot, and so therefore I ask, like, during this state, like, how much did you estimate sleeping?
Like per night?
Yeah, yeah.
5 to 6 hours typically, but I was probably spending at least 8, maybe 9 hours in bed.
Okay. So it was not so much that some people go into a place where they're like, I'm only sleeping like 3 hours. It wasn't that so much. It was more like the whole experience of it, and how it affected. That was more troubling. That was more troubling to you than like, I'm getting this amount of sleep.
Yeah, I think I was very sensitive to 5 hours, and sometimes I would dip into 4 or 3, and that was very unsettling for me too. But my baseline was more around 5, 6.
Got it.
But I wanted 8, and I used to get 8, and it felt like a real problem that I wasn't getting those 2 hours extra that I thought I needed.
Very, very helpful. This is super helpful. I think and I think everybody tunes in here get a very, very good picture of, you know, what was going on during that time. And then when did things start to change?
Well, I tried CBTi in a very conventional way, working with a therapist. It was very intimidating to me to cut down my sleep window with sleep restriction. Getting out of bed felt very unnatural and didn't make a lot of rational sense to me how it was really helping me, and caused a lot of anxiety for me. My sleep improved when I was working with her, but as soon as I stopped and my sleep had improved, it had felt like a real grueling journey to get there, and one that I hoped I would never repeat again. And almost as soon as I stopped working with this therapist who was doing CBTi with me, I relapsed into pretty deep insomnia, and I lost a lot of hope again, thinking I cannot do this this draconian feeling sleep regimen for the rest of my life. It causes me so much anxiety, and it's not working in the long term. So it felt like conventional CBTi was not getting to the root of my problem, because after doing it, felt like I was back at square one. And so I was looking for something else. And I found a book about applying acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a mindfulness-based approach to insomnia. And that got me started towards a new view of maybe some of my own internal reactivity to my feelings and my thoughts and the sensations in my body that are related to insomnia are somehow fueling this pattern. And perhaps there's a way I can change my relationship to what's going on inside of me that allows me to get out of my own way and allow sleep to naturally come over me. Because obviously trying to force my sleep, trying to control it in any way is not working for me.
Absolutely. And before we talk more about like the book and how things developed from then on, let's stay a second here on the CBTi thing. And by the way, you know, for everyone out there tuning in, me and Trevor, we had a private conversation a couple of weeks ago. And one thing that really, you know, I've had that notion for a while now, but it's really stuck with me how you described how like kind of the moment you stopped that course, everything came back again, and how I'm sure that happens to so many other people. I thought that was super important. But what, you know, looking back, what aspects of that traditional, it was kind of a traditional course, right? A 6-week or 8-week course or something like that. Yeah. So what part of that do you find, you know, looking back, what part of that increased your anxiety, and what, if anything, was helpful?
Yeah. You know, there's research that supports stimulus control and sleep restriction, which are limiting your time in bed and also getting out of bed. So you're not, you're reconditioning bed to equal sleep rather than bed equals I'm awake and aroused physiologically, and I'm worried. And so you recondition by not worrying in bed, by getting out of bed. But it felt like I was, you know, depriving myself of an opportunity to fall asleep by getting out of bed. And with the sleep restriction, it felt like the sleep window was too short to make me feel at ease about implementing that suggestion. I think it was 5.5 hours at first, something like that. And that was too short for me to feel okay doing it. It just caused too much anxiety. I needed something that was a little longer, that I could stomach a little more easily. I think that there's a lot of validity to sleep restriction, and we can get into that later, but it was too extreme in the version that was prescribed to me. Also, I don't think I had a good frame onto how to understand what I was doing. I was kind of told, you're going to do these things, it's going to help you, just do it. And I didn't have a set of attitudes or just a frame cognitively to understand why I was doing what I was doing fully, and how to deal with some of the resistance that inevitably is going to come up. So I was missing a piece of the knowledge about why this works and how to do it appropriately.
Absolutely. And it sounds like, you know, and we talked about this privately before too, but I think what, in my opinion, one of the best things with CBTi is that like the educational part of it, the 3P model and things like that, which seems like that wasn't really there, which made it even more.
Some of it was there, but I needed a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
I needed, my emotional reactivity to my insomnia was so strong that you could explain the perpetuating factors of insomnia to me, and I would forget about them because I was so distressed. And I would just go back into this pattern of cycling my own distress and my own despair, and being discouraged in the short term when I might have a couple of days of poor sleep, even though I'm supposed to be doing this thing that's helping me. I needed a wider net of knowledge to address all of the little objections, the little concerns that were coming up for me when I was approaching CBTi.
Absolutely. And, you know,
so that's what I've tried to do with my own program, is fill in all the gaps that confused me and that made me hit a wall, so people can keep going when they hit resistance that I think is pretty predictable.
100%. Couldn't agree with you more. And we'll of course talk much more about, you know, your approach and your program as we go forward. I just want to share something personal that I had led me to like a little bit more understanding of you know, the situation you're in when you have very active insomnia. It was somebody on the channel that left a comment describing kind of the panicked state they were in, and it was very well worded. And I thought, like, have I ever experienced that myself? And I remember this time when I was with my family in this kind of park. It was a big park, and my then I think 3-year-old daughter was missing, and I was like, what? Like, it was looking around, full of people. I was completely out of my mind. I was like, where is she? What's happening? Should I call the police? What's going to happen? Like that. And then I realized that is similar to that panic state that many people are in. And then I realized, like, how can you take in information there? How can you stop and listen? How can you learn? It's very, very tricky when you're in that spot. So
it's so true. It's very hard to be logical when you're in a state of panic.
Right.
And insomnia for me was certainly associated, not like a full-blown panic attack, but had a lot of elements of panic. And I remember pretty, distressing nights, climbing into bed and just feeling my whole body just go tense. My heart is pounding. Just not a state in which it's easy to think clearly about what's going to be helpful right now.
Yeah.
And you're in survival. You want to fight or run or freeze, and very hard to act in a helpful way.
Super helpful to hear this from you, Trevor. Very, very insightful. And now let's continue then. So which book was it, by the way, that you found?
So I found the Sleep book by Dr. Guy Meadows out of the UK. And that planted a lot of interesting seeds for me around, what would it be like if I had a more flexible and lenient attitude towards my own distress? What if I could break the cycle of my own reactivity?
Absolutely. And just to, continue sharing what happened. So you read that book, planted some seeds, and then did you kind of implement that, or you read more, or what happened next?
I did implement it, and it was very difficult for me to fully grasp, again, like this idea of changing my relationship in a radical way, to be willing to experience the discomfort of my insomnia, rather than struggling against it and all the energy that uses up, that could be directed towards more enjoyable, fulfilling things in my life. But it was stealing so much of my energy, just in my own emotional reactivity to it. And that planted some good ideas. Ultimately, my own method blended some of the acceptance with some other techniques that I learned in my own schooling around mindfulness-based approaches to emotional distress. And also, I did revisit some of the behavioral techniques in CBTi, but I implemented them in a way that was more gentle and more flexible. Because the rigidity of how they were applied in that first round was one of the main problems I had with them. One of the things that didn't make them a sustainable solution, that didn't make them something that I had any openness to wanting to continue again, especially if I had a flare-up of insomnia. So I blended this acceptance and commitment-based approach with some of the CBTi techniques. Because if you're all acceptance and commitment therapy, I found that there could be a level of pressure on myself to be responsible for my sleep again, in terms of I need to have the right attitude. I need to be perfectly accepting, otherwise I'm not going to sleep. And that's another recipe for performance anxiety. So some blend of changing my reactivity mixed with a gentle form of behavioral intervention, which just gives your body's natural drive to sleep an opportunity to do what it's supposed to do. And the two of those blended together seem to hit, for me and for some of the people I've worked with, a sweet spot of doing what I can, but not being perfect, and giving my body an opportunity to do what it already knows how to do. And then through that experience, regaining confidence in my ability to sleep naturally.
Perfect. I think, it all makes sense to me. And I think for anyone that tunes in and thinks like, okay, I want to understand it, we're gonna spend more time kind of really diving into your thoughts on this one. But before we do, just was it like, it almost sounds to me as if you kind of sat down and you kind of created your own method and then applied it to yourself? Did that happen, or was it more like, it organically became a method as you were kind of experimenting?
I had to experiment a while before it came together. And ultimately, I did apply it to myself. And it was the first thing that really worked for me. And then I could apply it to other people. But I had a sense, although my insomnia wasn't perfect, as I began to do the acceptance and commitment stuff, it was making a lot of sense to me. And I knew that I wanted to help other people who are struggling with insomnia, even before my own insomnia was totally gone. But somewhere in that process, I did figure out this formula that was sustainable and really produced results for me. And then I wrote a lot of it down, and I documented all the pitfalls I experienced along the path, and have tried in my offering to address all the places that I fell down and that other people might fall down too.
Absolutely. And one question here, were there, like, as you started learning, applying this to yourself, etc., would you say it was mostly a kind of like, things were getting a little bit better week by week or month by month, or were there these kind of like magical moments where you're like, oh, I slept really well that time, or things like of that nature?
Yeah, really until I found the sweet spot, like I was talking about. Sometimes I would have nights or stretches of nights where everything was going fine. It felt like, I finally reached the point I was looking for. My insomnia is gone forever. This is fine. But then then maybe the next week I'd have some of the worst sleep of my life for whatever reason. It was very confusing. And it ultimately pointed to something that was imbalanced about how I was approaching it. And for me, when I started with acceptance and commitment therapy, there was too much. It was subtly becoming a performance again. I needed to perform acceptance perfectly, and then my anxiety would go away. And ultimately, it's just not. I was missing the point. But it's so easy to reinstitute this problem-solving mode around insomnia.
100%. Perfect. So I think, yeah, as you and I were talking before, Trevor, we talked about like how to do this podcast, and we now, we've pretty much heard your story, which is super, super helpful. And so tell us as we go forward here, like more about your method. Maybe we could use it as let's say you have a client that has insomnia, obviously, like how, what's most important? How do you start working with them? And tell us your approach.
Yeah. So I do emphasize education, like you were talking about, in terms of the 3P model, and emphasizing that sleep is a natural biological process that can't be controlled consciously. We can't control when we fall asleep, can't control if we wake up and how long it takes us to go back to sleep, but we can control the behaviors and the attitudes and our own awareness of how we're relating to our internal events in such a way that we can set the stage for sleep. And if we set the stage for sleep really well, it's just going to happen if we stick to it. And so setting that stage with my clients, I then talk about all the ways that you've probably been trying to address insomnia that are actually working against you, which are these control-based methods of trying to stay in bed longer to catch up on sleep, or going to bed at really inconsistent times, or checking the clock all night so you can have a detailed analysis of just how terribly you're sleeping, or exercising super hard during the day so you can be sure you're going to sleep that night, which just puts more pressure on you to sleep and more frustration if it doesn't work out. All the pills and supplements and sedatives that people might use to knock themselves out, anything that you use to control yourself, cutting out all coffee because it's the devil and it's gonna ruin my sleep even if I have it at 7 a.m. Just all of these extreme ways of thinking that normal sleepers never think about. And there are some things that you need to do that normal sleepers don't do, but there's so many things insomniacs do that are so unhelpful because they think it's going to give them a sense of control over their sleep, but you can't control your sleep, and they just set themselves up for failure and disappointment. and maybe even putting their insomnia more on a pedestal of this thing that's ruining their life and that is causing them to feel hopeless and despair. And it just creates a very vicious cycle of the more I try to help myself, the worse my sleep seems to be getting, and the worse I feel about it, and then I'm worrying about it more, and then I'm sleeping worse and worse and worse. And it feels like I'm powerless. So just laying out that model of the trap that so many of us fall into is a relief for a lot of clients, because they can relate to that. And it points to the fact that all the ways that they've been spending effort addressing their insomnia, you know, it makes sense. You're trying your best, and those kind of strategies work in a lot of other areas of life, but there's something about insomnia that they just don't work for. And so recognizing that some of the effort was futile is a relief for people, because it gives them permission to stop doing those things. And it points a finger towards a new possibility, that there is something that they can do, but it's not what they have been doing, and that we can figure out what those things are and do them and get back to sleep.
100%. Well said. Super well said. And, you know, one way I sometimes try to explain how it is so tricky and how you get so entangled is this almost not a riddle, but it's kind of the way I express it is something like this, that it is very hard to solve the problem when your act of problem solving is the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
something I read about that also, you know, I read another book. It was actually Eckhart Tolle's. Like, I've never read him before, read a book by him, but he's talked something about how, like, it is hard for a detective to solve a crime when it turns out that they themselves are like the culprit, you know. I think that gives you an idea of why you get so entangled and it's so hard to see the way out.
Insomnia is a very paradoxical condition.
100%. Now, I know this is it's a big question and hard question to answer, but when you talked earlier about like how you said, if you set the stage, then sleep almost becomes inevitable. And I know that anybody who hears this is going to be like, how did I set the stage? So I know it's hard to ask, but just as an overview, like, how do you set the stage?
Yeah. So it goes back to the 3P model and the perpetuating factors. And my model my approach draws that out a little bit. Typically, the perpetuating factors, there's a focus on external behaviors that you can do that will set the stage for sleep. So that's really restricting your sleep window to amp up your biological drive to sleep, and also getting out of bed. So you're doing this kind of conditioning process to reassociate bed with sleep. That conditioning process is evident when you walk through the threshold of your bedroom door and you begin to feel anxiety in your body. That's a conditioning response. And so the idea is to reverse it. All well and good, especially when applied in a balanced way. But in my model, I have a lot of emphasis on not just external behaviors, but internal behaviors, how you're relating to the contents of your own body and mind. And that there are certain ways of responding to your internal events that perpetuate insomnia. And there are certain ways of responding that give you a chance to break that cycle. And so I do talk about the external behaviors, but my program has a big emphasis on the internal behaviors as well. And the core internal behavior is stopping the cycle of reactive struggle against the thoughts, the worrisome thoughts, the dreadful feelings, and the distressing physiological sensations associated with sleeplessness and worry about sleeplessness. So it's built on a foundation of a principle of acceptance. And acceptance is a strange word that a lot of people have a lot of different associations with. And how I define acceptance is opening yourself up with awareness to what's happening to you in the present moment and allowing it to be without struggling against it. It doesn't mean you're accepting the fact that you're going to be sleepless forever. It means in this moment, what's happening to me, and is my response to what's happening to me, maybe that response could be fixation on a thought, or my perception of my own worry makes me worry even more, and then I'm just in a ball of anxiety over here. that those subjective responses to what appears to be arising in the field of our awareness can be really problematic, or we can just accept that I am having a worrisome thought, or I am having a knot in my stomach. But if I can soften my awareness of this, if I can open up to it, if I can say yes to it, I'm not saying I like it, but I'm saying, yes, I can allow this to be here right now. It probably will change, but in this moment, I can allow myself to be with it. Rather than just like clenching and struggling against it and trying to make it go away, when really we don't have great control over our thoughts and feelings. They happen to us so often, it feels. And so if that's true, then the most helpful response is to respond in a way that doesn't amplify them, that doesn't make them worse than they need to be. And through that changing your own reactivity to the thoughts or feelings that come up, there's a real liberation that can occur, because you realize that you don't have to be tyrannized by your own thoughts so much as we often are, or we don't need the meanings that we've prescribed to our feelings maybe are in error. Maybe there's another way, a more expansive and well-perspectived way to understand how to relate to our own feelings. And what I love about this method is it really creates a lot of relief around some of the energy, intense struggle that goes into fighting against insomnia. But if you learn these techniques of acceptance and some of the things that I want to talk about a little later, it really translates into the rest of your life. And life inevitably has suffering and inevitably has struggle. And using these tools of acceptance to change your relationship to what's going on, and from a more spacious awareness of your emotions, of your thoughts, where you're not so reactive to them, you're just kind of watching them in an objective way. You can choose how you behave, and you can choose to behave in ways that bring you towards a rich and rewarding life, even if in this moment there's suffering.
Very, very well said again. Makes tons of sense. And just, to bring that to like something, an example that often comes up on my channel and clients, patients, etc. Somebody who understands that they're kind of obsessing about sleep. Like I can't stop thinking. They understand that's a problem, but they just can't stop it. And thinking of what you just said, perhaps something like, okay, I'm obsessing about this right now, and at this moment, I'm gonna actually accept that. I'm gonna allow myself to have these thoughts, these obsessive thoughts, without judging myself for them. Or is that aligned? Is that sort of aligned with your thinking?
Mm-hmm.
Or or another way to say it, for somebody specific, that I'm obsessing about it and I know it's a problem and I can't stop it. How would you kind of guide that person?
Yeah. So one aspect of it is making space for what is, and that spaciousness can reduce reactivity. One way to think of it is just imagine if you're feeling a lot of anxiety. Acceptance is especially great for feeling. So if you feel a lot of anxiety, to just to create space around it, to imagine you are a volume, like a sphere. You're a big sphere, just to imagine it in your mind. And to imagine that anxiety, that dread in your body as this, gnarled little ball. And it's within the sphere, but maybe it only takes up 10% of the volume of the whole sphere. And just imagining that you are also the other 90% of space around that little ball of anxiety. And just that kind of visual can create a sense of, okay, there's more going on than just this distress. And where can I place my attention to not feel suffocated by this experience? But especially with thoughts, one tool that can be useful in my approach is this notion of diffusion. And diffusion means to decouple yourself, or it's the opposite of fusion, which is the melding of two things. Those two things being, one, your thoughts, and two, yourself. When we have a lot of really intense, anxious thoughts, there can be a sense that thought that we're fixating on, that worry about how bad tomorrow is going to be if I don't get to sleep soon, or that worry about, will I sleep tonight? And if I don't, what does this say about how bad my life's going to be for years to come? That can be so horrifying and so suffocating when we're enmeshed totally with that thought. And so diffusion is a way of creating space and separation between you as a self and that thought as just a thought that is here right now, but I can choose whether I sink my teeth into that thought or if I just watch it. And thoughts have this quality when you're just watching them of carrying on, and something else comes in and replaces it. And one of the ways to do that is just to become really familiar with the habitual thoughts that arise around insomnia. I think insomnia is so funny because we have these habitual thoughts like, oh my God, tomorrow is going to be so bad. And when that thought is upon us, even if we've had 100 days where we've had that thought and we've made it through the day, even though it's been, a little unpleasant, that night 100, we're having that thought. And it's like the first time we've ever had that thought. It feels that real. We feel like it just feels like the end of the world sometimes. And so to recognize that, oh, this is that thought again, I've had this a million times. Hi, there you are. You're just a thought. Yes, you have meaning, and I'm not detracting from the fact that there's some fear here, there's some worry here, and I can respect that. But I can also be aware that this is just a thought, and that it doesn't need to dictate how I behave. And it doesn't need to dictate also where I place my attention. I don't need to fixate on this thought. I can carry on and fixate on making dinner. Even if I'm tired, I can do the dishes. I can be with my family and just place my focus there. And yes, this thought is coming up, but just because it's present in my mind doesn't actually mean that much. It doesn't mean I must address it. It doesn't mean I need to make it go away in order to sleep. And that way of changing your relationship to it changes the meaning of the thought. It's just the thought after a while, if you become in the practice of doing it. And it doesn't mean very much.
No, 100% makes total sense. And I think, it was some phrasing that I picked up from, what's her name? Brooke Castillo from the Life Coach School. But she says often that, thoughts are sentences in our brain. I think, that's a very good way of phrasing it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So
yeah.
I think, I think at this point, it's almost like I want to let you take the reins here, and you guide us through Trevor. You wrote some things you wanted to talk about, but you mentioned earlier, like, I want to talk about this later on. But at this point, what are some other things you want to talk about here? What are thoughts you want to share, etc.?
So one thing that I added from my own studies into my program that I really like. Because although it's important to get space and perspective on our thoughts, on our feelings, to distance ourselves from them in a way so they don't have such catastrophic meaning that amps up our fear response, our arousal system. It's also important to tend to ourselves, to care for ourselves, because we are experiencing fear. We are struggling. We are feeling hopeless sometimes with insomnia. And one way to do that, which is another angle on just changing your relationship with your habitual ways of responding to your internal events, your emotions, your feelings, thoughts, is this idea of self-compassion, which, if mindfulness is asking yourself, and mindfulness and acceptance have a lot to do with each other. You have to be aware of what's going on in the present moment and be able to watch it without a lot of judgment. That's the foundation of acceptance. Self-compassion is more about acknowledging what's going on in the present moment and giving yourself a lot of care. Like, if you were having a tough day, you got home and you just felt kind of shattered after this long day, and you sat down and you're just ready to cry almost, because life is so difficult right now. And how would it feel if you had a good friend come up to you, someone you really trusted, you could be really honest with, and they sit down with you, they really listen closely to how you're feeling, what's going on for you, they give you a hug, and they sympathize with you, and then they talk about, I know you're struggling right now, what would be the next best step we could do to help you get a hold on what's going on in your life? You'd feel great, probably. We as human beings are so healed by connection with others and so soothed by it when we're suffering. And insomnia is something that so many of us suffer with in the sense of isolation, because maybe the people in our lives around us aren't sleeping fine, can feel so alone in it. And self-compassion is a way of extending that same care that friend might extend to you that feels so good, but learning how to extend it to yourself, learning how to care for yourself, learning how to talk to yourself like a wise parent might to a child who's distressed. And it really is very, very soothing. Part of it is talking to yourself, literally regarding yourself, the part of you that's suffering, almost as a child in your own mind. And how would you respond? What would be the appropriate way as a caring parent for that child to care for it, to be there for it? And the idea isn't to make all the suffering go away, but it is to hold it in the sense of care and compassion. And it's very transformative to do that. And another piece of it is to remind yourself that human beings suffer. It's just part of life. And insomniacs are all over the place. And you're not the only one who's having trouble sleeping. You're not the only one who's having this despair. It's quite common, actually, maybe 10 to 15% of the whole population. And even the people who aren't sleeping perfectly, maybe they have a lot of distress in their life for other reasons. And you're not alone in that suffering. That can be another soothing element. So that's one other piece of changing the relationship to yourself. And so some mix then between acceptance, between diffusion from your thoughts, and between self-compassion is kind of a triad for me of tending to yourself in a skillful way. Those internal behaviors that cut off the cycle of reactivity and fear that end up perpetuating insomnia.
Super important, and makes so much sense. I love hearing these words, and it's interesting. This element of self-compassion, self-kindness is something that I think in the last couple of months only myself realized how important they were, because as you know, particularly people with insomnia are just so hard on themselves. A lot of self-blame, judgment, and a lot of things that I think really can put you in a place of when you think that you are at fault, you are the problem, you so easily get stuck. There seems like there's no way out. And the way your analogy was very similar to one that I've started adapting, which was very similar again, but the way I've started saying it is imagine that somebody came to you describing what happened to you. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't go, "What's wrong with you? Why can't you get a grip?" What's that. You would go, "This happens. It's all right. Be kind and gentle, etc." And then try to be like that to yourself. Very, very similar to your teaching. I think it's super important.
And it's hard at first to feel natural doing that. It can feel contrived. It can feel fake. But if you keep doing it, it stops feeling contrived and fake, and it starts feeling like, wow, I love myself, and this feels really good. So you got to push through the imposter phase.
Good
point. It becomes real.
Never thought of that one, but it's like everything else. It's almost like if you keep doing it, you get better at it. Which then immediately we think of no effort. You don't want to go to effort, but yeah, I think absolutely, 100%. And so currently, you offer you work with people both locally, but also online, I guess.
Yeah, anywhere I offer online coaching.
And what do you have is it a certain week offering, and what's included in it? So how do you communicate with clients, etc.?
So I typically do weekly sessions that go 6-7 weeks. typically is a full course, but could go less, could go more, depending on individual needs. I've got so I talk through these ideas in each session, and I listen to what's going on for my clients, and I try to tailor my approach to best fit them. And then I've written pretty extensively about all the concepts that I have. And so I give these written handouts. And I think that those are really key, because it's so hard to just hear some idea about how to relate to your insomnia and then just do it without any stumbling. And it's very, very valuable to be able to revisit an idea and keep grappling with, how does this idea apply to what I'm experiencing right now? How have I slipped back into my old way of relating to this? What's that say again? So I try to give anchors in the form of these written handouts.
Super helpful. And I think another real benefit with these written handouts or a curriculum or whatever it is that when you give somebody something that obviously you had written way before, and somebody reads it and it's like, yeah, this really applies to me. I think it can really make you feel like, oh yeah, he wasn't just saying that because, he thought I needed to hear that in this moment. I have the same thought patterns. I am in the same spot as so many others. And then that helped you feel less isolated, but more importantly, even what worked for others will work for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very well.
I want to touch on a couple more aspects that blend in with the changing your relationship to your internal environment, that just kind of round out the method that I use.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one is bringing back in the behavioral methods. So I do prescribe oftentimes a shorter window for being in bed than a lot of clients are used to, but nothing so extreme that it causes more anxiety. And that's just, again, to not rely solely on how you're responding to yourself in order to overcome your insomnia, because it's too much pressure. You want to respond to yourself in a helpful way, but you also want to set the stage through potentially getting out of bed sometimes if you feel a lot of anxiety and you can't sleep, and just go do something relaxing. And that can reset your relationship to sleep, mixed with the gentle restriction of your time in bed to create a window that works in your favor rather than sabotages your progress. That's a big cornerstone, along with watching how you relate to yourself. And then finally, there are attitudes that are really important to adopt, and that if you are missing, sometimes you can just spin your wheels if you're just trying to relate to yourself in a helpful way. Attitudes like, don't be too attached to how you sleep tonight. That is so important to internalize, that to really get through insomnia, you need to be okay going and having a pretty tired day. You need to be okay if your night doesn't go so well. And a lot of these tools of relating to yourself when you're having that daytime distress can begin to invite in that experience of okayness, even though this is not ideal. And bringing that experience back to the next night, if you can trust that you can make it, even if you don't sleep that well, it just stops becoming such a problem. And I think that's really important to hold as an ideal, this notion of, what if I got to the point that even if I didn't fall asleep for the next 3 hours, I actually believed I would be pretty fine the next day. That maybe it would be tough sometimes, but I'd also have these moments of maybe even enjoyment, or I could for sure still do what I need to do. And so that's an important part too, just challenging some of the notions about catastrophe that come with insomnia.
100%. And you said something there, you used something I don't think I've ever heard, but I was like, that is a really cool term that I'm going to start using, which is okayness. Have you used that, or did it just come up in this for the moment?
I don't know. I think that's a word in my vocabulary, so possibly I have.
I love it. It's like so unintimidating. It's like being okay with something. It's something we always use that word, like, I'm okay with it. It feels very real. unintimidating. Sounds like a very common, familiar word for everyone. And then to put it into like, approach this with okayness. I love it. It sounds so fresh. I'm gonna copy that.
Good.
And what else was I gonna say? Oh yeah. I just want to say something actually. That I think I shared with you also before, Trevor. But I just like for the record here, it is so. It is so. It's such a sweet experience, if you want to put it that way. Whenever you actually, as somebody in our position, like somebody who's a coach or a therapist, something like that, when you see that your ideas are not that out there, meaning I think there aren't that many people who are truly invested in, engaged, and passionate about helping people that have trouble sleeping. So like I remember when I was starting, to connect with people about 2 years ago, I met with Michael Schwartz and Martin Reed, some of who you may know, and when I first talked to them, it was like I was in like, Nicaragua, and I had my own like, ecosystem of thoughts. And then I got a glimpse of like Botswana. I was like, whoa, there's some new ideas here, but they're similar to mine. And like talking to you is like, now I'm in Madagascar, like, yeah, this is so cool. And so I just want to say like, it's so nice to connect with you and like get a glimpse of your ideas and thoughts and learning from you.
Yeah, different ecosystems of insomnia treatment.
Exactly. So how, what's, if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Yeah, my website is probably the best way. It's liberatedsleep.com. And you can read more about my approach there. And there's a contact form. You can get in touch with me over email. And if you're interested in working with me, we can set something up.
Perfect. And I'll, of course, include that in the description. So thanks so much, Trevor, for coming on. And I look forward to talking more with you as time goes along.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Daniel. It's great to talk to you.